Welcome.
Oh, wait, hang on 1 second. I'm sorry, there's a problem here.
I've got it.
Sorry, 1 second. Oh, Joseph got it. That's right. Sorry, I was thinking I had more power than I had.
That's all right.
Please, Brian, go ahead.
So welcome everyone to our panel on diversifying the core. I will say I've had some internet connection issues at the house, and so somebody please text me if I go out on you too often. I could, but in the house that might help, but this is usually a spot where I do things, so I'm sticking to it. So revising and expanding core. Given the Black Lives Matter movement, the need for diversity and inclusion in American society has become even more urgent. Colleges and universities in particular, their general education programs are no exception. To what extent do our general education curricula reflect diversity? How might instructors and programs best address inclusion in courses where a list of core texts shapes the curriculum? That list of core texts chosen reflects the consensus of some academic literary tradition, as well as local history and institutional distinctives. So this panel will reflect on an ongoing process of revision of core books program in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercer University. Our multi-year process seeks to address the representation of works by women and people of color in the core text readings of the 7 Great Books courses that constitute one option for general education within the college. The panel tonight does not engage the whole range of courses, but for the focus gives particular attention to the 5th and 6th courses in the sequence or to the junior year. My paper, however, first seeks to set forth the process of revision as a whole. College of Liberal Arts and Sciences complete a 30 to 39 hour general education program as part of their degree. All students take 2 courses in a foreign language, 1 in science, 1 in mathematical reasoning. And for the remaining 7 general education courses, students choose between 2 tracks. Students who choose the integrative track take 4 courses from a traditional distributional model, as well as 3 courses in integrative studies that focus on student writing and oral communication. In the other option, the Great Books sequence, students take 7 courses that move chronologically from Homeric Greece to the 20th century. These courses feature student-centered and text-centered discussion of primary foundational texts. When I became the director of Great Books in July 2017, the dean's charge to me included a multi-year revision of our core reading lists for the 7 courses, with an eye to the inclusion of women writers, Muslim writers, and writers of color. The core text readings are readings that are required for all sections of a given course, but they do not prescribe the entire reading list for a given course. As a result, students across the different sections share a common core of readings that constitute the basis for further conversations and comparisons of texts as a sequence progresses. But there are some texts that individual sections will read while others will not. The Great Books program at Mercer originated from another curricular innovation that began in 1970, the Freshman Seminar Program, or FSP. At the heart of that seminar program was the faculty's use of alternative pedagogies to engage students more directly in their own education. Mercer faculty interest in the Great Books curriculum began as a continuation of that desire. Faculty first developed a continuation of FSP with an emphasis on classical Greek texts as one course offered in the third quarter of the first year. Interest in expanding that offering developed, and faculty began planning for a more comprehensive program through faculty conversations as well as consultations with the faculty at St. John's. Those conversations led to the development of the proposal of a Great Books program of 8 courses, along with a broad set of suggested readings. And in April 1983, Dean Rollin Armour authorized Michael Cass to recruit faculty for the program. Those who volunteered and were accepted formed the initial cohort for each course and worked in summer workshops that year to refine choices based on an initial list. As the faculty crafted the initial curriculum for the program, their conversation with the wider Great Books tradition in American higher education, particularly the curriculum at St. John's, as well as their own areas of interest and expertise, shaped the selection of texts for the courses. Beginning in 1987, faculty added a 9th course that focused on the 20th century. Examination of a history of the program over the next 30 years reveals some gradual changes in the curriculum. At times, broader curricular changes in the college, such as the conversion from quarters to semesters in the 1990s, or the reduction of the total number of hours in general education requirements in the past decade, required changes in the Great Books curriculum. Other changes reflected discussions among the program faculty and a shifting consensus regarding the precise shape of the core, particularly in the upper level courses. The use of some texts became more common, including some texts that had not been part of the core, while the use of others diminished. So given this history, I began the process of revision with deliberate care. First, I decided that revision should begin with the 3 upper level courses. And one feature of the program is that some readings in the junior years require knowledge of previous works. And to gain that, students need to read these foundational works to understand the more recent ones. For students to make sense of Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, for example, they need to know something of Calvin. So reading Weber in the senior course means choosing to read Calvin in the sophomore course in the spring over reading Martin Luther. So changes in the upper level course would affect the list of texts that students would read there in the sequence, perhaps. Secondly, I encourage the instructors in the junior and senior courses to experiment with new readings to see what additional texts might increase diversity and which ones might work well in concert with others. And so I organized a series of conversations for those instructors, held at least once a semester with additional email exchanges about the text and the shape of the canon or the shape of the core text for those particular courses. And so tonight's panel reflects much of that discussion and the work on the 2 junior courses. At the same time, the senior course, which had already included W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, began expanding to look at the poetry of Emily Dickinson, which, by the way, had been on the initial list in 1983, but also Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. In addition, some instructors experimented with readings that added diversity to the 2 sophomore courses. Several sections of the fall course included women mystics like Julian of Norwich or Hildegard of Bingen. And additions to the spring course included Marguerite de Navarre's The Heptameron. But with the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown of the university for the last part of spring 2020, along with the shift, frankly, to survival mode for the faculty, decided to any formal meetings to ratify the discussions that had been evolving. But given the murder of Ahmaud Arbery on February the 23rd, Breonna Taylor on March 13th, and George Floyd on May 25th last spring, and the resulting protest, Black Lives Matter, concerns for justice and inclusion moved to the forefront of national attention in ways that, again, focused our need for curricular reform. And so our new director, Charlie Thomas, who was in the third cohort of Great Books students in the 1980s and who has taught in the program for 27 years, has continued and expanded our discussions regarding diversity and inclusion in the Great Books program, setting some goals for a 3-year process of revision. This year, for example, she created some space for extensive conversation by setting up a Canvas course for the working group of instructors of each Great Books course, designating a leader for each one. And the working groups have been compiling a number of, have completed a number of steps already. They've compiled a comprehensive list of texts that have been taught in their particular course, including those on the core list, but as in addition, others that have been taught recently. Then some of the groups have met on Zoom to discuss those choices and to reflect on ways that particular texts work in combination. They created lists of possible core texts written by women and people of color, sharing those again with each other in conversation. In addition, Charlie's encouraged instructors to use 20% of their course readings to add text by women and people of color. And she solicited recommendations from the Women and Gender Studies faculty and the Africana Studies faculty. The working groups will report to the program faculty at the end of the academic year. And that process will repeat for the next 2 academic years, with the working groups developing a proposal for revision for the curriculum in 22-23. So the process has articulated a way forward for revision, building on the previous initiatives begun before Charlie became director. Throughout, the focus has been on innovation and experimentation, as well as continued conversation among the faculty, so that the faculty has ownership of the process as they pilot various texts and combinations of text in their courses. Crafting a more diverse set of readings does matter. Developing inclusive strategies for reading foundational texts in ways that honor student diversity also matters. Our efforts do both of those things, in the end, can strengthen the voices of a diverse cadre of students in their own struggles for justice. Surely, part of the rhetorical power of Martin Luther King's letter for Birmingham jail lay in his rootedness in the foundational philosophical and theological text of the Western intellectual tradition. That rootedness is made even more clear, as Roosevelt Montas pointed out to me, in the syllabi that King crafted when he taught at Morehouse. King's legacy and the legacy of those who will pass through our classrooms reminds us that in our efforts to create more inclusive curricula, as well as more inclusive practices for our classrooms, will enable our students in the end to become seedbeds for hope. Our panel will proceed in talking about different elements of our junior level courses, 305 in the fall and 306 in the spring. And I'll just ask each of my colleagues to introduce yourself and say your formal title if you'd like to do that, or at least your department and a couple of interests. So we begin with Jim May.
Are we just introducing, or are we going right into the paper?
Oh, yeah. So if you'll introduce yourself and then go into your paper, and then we'll move on after that to Tom and Kevin and Ed.
All right,
Thanks,
great.
Jim.
So I'm Jim May. I direct the creative writing program at Mercer. I'm a poet, which will be part of my talk. And I want to say that my paper doesn't so much make an argument for a particular text, but a diversity of forms. And I think that I'm focusing on the lyric, and I think that this would be one way of definitely expanding the diversity of the reading list. And so this is, the title is "The Best Defense of Poetry Might Be Insanity, the Lyric's Place in the Great Books Program." And so I'm writing today as a poet who teaches in the Mercer University Great Books Program, which is a tenuous position, seeing as how the curriculum begins with my entire vocation, the imitative tribe, being banished. Sure, eventually we'll be called back into the Republic so long as we can justify our position, but the exile stings and has made poets what we might call overly defensive. Think of Shelley and Sidney. We feel we have to justify ourselves because, well, we've been told we need to. And that need for justification extends all the way to the syllabus. And so my argument in this paper is purely justification. The lyric poem counters the larger ideas we read about in the program with the individual voice. It makes it difficult for us to generalize. It, to use a word that was all the rage at my MFA program, problematizes easy solutions. Moreover, the lyric poem's emphasis on the psyche, the self, the soul, whatever you'd like to call it, and its entity's well-being makes it all the more important, not now, but always. Even the title of the Great Books Program puts poets at a disadvantage. Poets write not just a poem at a time, but a line at a time. Epics are rare, especially in the last 2 centuries. And even though I'll argue Wordsworth's lyrical ballads is as influential as any other book on the Great Books reading list, save the Bible, celebrated books of poetry are uncommon. Frost's North of Boston, Bishop's Geography 3, Lowell's Life Studies, Brooks's The Bean Eaters, and more recently Jericho Brown's The Tradition are certainly great poetry collections. Great poems, though, have more influence than great poetry books, probably because the lyric has an intensity that's hard to sustain for pages. And yet, the Great Books Program skews towards narrative. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Inferno, and Paradise Lost all rightfully get their due. Things fall off, though, in the 19th century, when what I've already told you is the most important book of that age, in this poet's education anyway, lyrical ballads, isn't listed as an option on our Great Books list, but falls instead under the blanket category romantic poetry. The following class, Great Books 407, The Age of Ambivalence, meanwhile, does not require any poetry, lyrical or otherwise. And here I would make an argument for Derek Walcott, Nobel laureates Derek Walcott and Wisława Szymborska, who would provide diverse voices that also speak to the tradition. What place then does the little lyric have on a curriculum of books with such thick spines? Well, its lack of physical bulk might be my craft's greatest feature, both in this program and the larger world. Lyric poetry, smarter people than I have argued, is the first form of literature, maybe even art, a cry of pain or a song of joy that told or continues to tell us what it's like to be a human being. Indeed, the lyric is a better representation of what it's like to be a particular person at a particular time than any other form of writing is. It tells us, too, what it's like to be a human being other than ourselves, the most valuable lesson a book can teach us. And it does so in very little space. In addition to being intense and concentrated, it's also agile and flexible. It can go almost anywhere, including the syllabus. But should it? Having taught poetry for nearly half my life, I know that most students, approach poetry, lyric poetry in particular, with either severe dislike or wildly silly yet positive misconception of what it is. Poetry is, they say, all about whatever you make of it. It's about being creative, not following the rules. Between the two approaches, I'd sooner side with the former, as I dislike bad poetry as much as they do. Both approaches, though, stifle a person's ability to read poetry. If we dislike poetry for whatever reason, the game's already lost. And if we think it's whatever we want it to be, we get frustrated when a good poem takes control of our imagination and forces us to see what the poet wants us to see instead of taking the lines however we want to take them. That is, it makes us think when we don't want to think. When my class approached the Romantic poets this semester then, I had more than a little trepidation. Should I have included any poetry at all, I worried. As much as they enjoyed standing up to Rousseau, Smith, and even Kant, prior to our first week of poetry, many students told me that they didn't get poetry or were bad at it. Indeed, the day we read Tintern Abbey, Frost at Midnight, and This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, I had an unusually high number of absences, among them some of the most curious and engaged students. The second day, I paired Coleridge's Dejection and Ode with Wordsworth's Ode, Intimations of Immortality. But here I frame the entire discussion by saying rather directly that these poems were about mental health before that term was an actual term. I wanted them to read with that in mind. I added some biographical context too. Coleridge published Dejection on Wordsworth's wedding day. And can you imagine writing the thank you note for that present? And that the Intimations Ode was completed as a response to Coleridge's, as was Wordsworth's resolution in Independence. And I offered some gossip too, revealing that Dejection is written to a woman that Coleridge was madly in love with, that she, like his wife, was named Sarah. And she was his best friend's wife's sister. Anyway, what's important here is that in the great books tradition, these texts are in conversation with each other. But what's the conversation about? Well, it's about, as Coleridge writes at the opening of stanza 2, a grief without a pang, void, dark, and drear, a stifled, drowsy, unimpassioned grief which finds no outlet, no relief in word or sigh or tear. What's Coleridge describing here, I asked my students. They were definitive and unanimous in their assessment: depression. And later in that stanza, where Coleridge describes the storm brewing in the distance, my students made a remarkable observation. First, here are those 12 lines. All this long eve, so balmy and serene, have I been gazing on the western sky in its peculiar tint of yellow-green. And still I gaze, and with how blank an eye, and those thin clouds above in flakes and bars that give away their motion to the stars, those stars that glide behind them or between, now sparkling, now bedimmed, but always seen, yon crescent moon as fixed as if it grew in its own cloudless, starless lake of blue. I see them so excellently fair. I see, not feel, how beautiful they are. To see that something is beautiful but not feel it, this, my students said, is the essence of depression. It's like when people tell a depressed person to just feel better. They just can't will themselves out of it, was the gist of one comment. It's a remarkable thing, I think, that an emotion experienced 219 years ago could be comprehended so keenly by my students, all of whom were masked and spend a good portion of their time, like Coleridge, talking to people who aren't actually in the room with them, but for wildly different reasons and under markedly different circumstances. My intention in this paper, however, isn't to close read the poem. We made similar observations about Wordsworth in ways that weren't the case for the other text. We felt the writers in the room with us. So what? This talk of emotion and depression seems somewhat wishy-washy and, to be honest, embarrassingly on brand for a poet, especially when put on the same stage as the categorical imperative, the will, the invisible hand, the Federalist Papers. We're after great ideas of what the program calls political, religious, philosophical, and scientific thought. Why care so much about a melancholic, lovesick opium addict? How does this poet's pain help us understand anything? To answer that question, let's jump in probably to 20th century Poland and the work of Wisława Szymborska, her incredibly important poem, Starvation Camp near Jasło. Write it. Write in ordinary ink on ordinary paper, the poem begins. They weren't given food. They all died of hunger. All? How many? It's a large meadow. How much grass per head? Write it down. I don't know. History rounds off skeletons to 0. 1,001 is still only 1,000. That one seems never to have existed. A fictitious fetus, an empty candle, or an empty cradle, a primer open for no one, air that laughs, cries and grows, stares for a void, bounding out to the garden, no one spot in the ranks. Poetry. Lyric poetry in particular, good lyric poetry to be more precise, focuses on that one, that number that history rounds off and willfully forgets. There is something insanely impractical about the lyric poem and its relationship to history, a relationship not unlike the unknown protester standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. It opposes time and generalization. It says that a single person has significance despite evidence to the contrary. Joy, love, sadness, and yes, depression, these things matter. Another Pole, Tadeusz Różewicz, in the middle of life, writes, that old woman pulling a goat on a rope is more needed, is more than the 7 wonders of the world. Anyone who thinks or feels she isn't needed is guilty of genocide. It's a bold claim, but an earned one, considering the pressures it was written under. So why lyric poetry? Because as the poet Edward Hirsch writes, the intimacy of the lyric and the lyric poem is the most intimate and personally volatile form of literary discourse, asserts the value and primacy of the solitary voice, the individual feeling. Without that individual voice and feeling, the ideas discussed in the Great Books program risk becoming mechanical policy. Maybe interesting, but also dangerous for what they admit and exclude. No wonder so many governments have tried to kick poets out. To put this argument another way, if we're going to understand the self, we need to hear from it, and the lyric poet is the most direct route. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Our next presenter is Tom Bullington. Tom.
Hello, everybody. Y'all can hear me, correct? Excellent. Like Jim, I'm a lecturer of liberal arts, so I teach both the Mercer's INT Integrative Studies programs and Great Books programs. And I am presenting on 2 texts that I've tried, both in one in Great Books 305 and one in Great Books 306. So I will go ahead and jump right in. So I began teaching Great Books 306 in spring 2018 and Great Books 305 in fall 2018. From the outset, I was concerned with the lack of female courses in the Great Books curriculum. So I introduced Lady Mary Wortley Montague in Great Books 306, in Great Books 305, and Mary Wollstonecraft in Great Books 306. Both have proven crucial. Splitting my focus between these 2 writers and these 2 courses, I will likewise split my presentation into 2 parts and attempt to tie them together at the end. Starting chronologically then, I'm going to open with a moment from Mary Wortley Montague's Turkish embassy letters that has received much attention recently. Montague's husband, Edward Montague, was deployed as an ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, so she traveled with her husband during this diplomatic deployment. In one of her letters, she writes her childhood friend back in England, Sarah Chiswell, from the city of Adrianople. In this letter, dated 1718, Montague assures Chiswell that those dreadful stories you have heard of the plague have very little foundation in truth. This plague was the smallpox, and as is often the case in her letters, Montague's tone is corrective. Her British correspondents assume that Turkey is a land of dark and barbaric mystery, despotic and unenlightened. In short, all of the Western imaginings of the East that Edward Said has brilliantly exposed and critiqued. Later in the same letter, Montague assures her correspondent of the invention of engrafting. Montague narrates the procedure as follows. There is a set of old women who make it their business to perform the operation. Every autumn, people make parties for this purpose and are met by the old woman who comes with a nutshell full of the matter of the best sort of smallpox and asks what veins you wish to be opened. She then puts into the vein as much venom as can lie upon the head of her needle, and afterward binds up the little wound with a hollow bit of shell. They then remain in perfect health until the 8th day. Then the fever begins to seize them, and they keep to their beds for 2 days, very seldom 3. Every year, thousands undergo the procedure, and the French ambassador says pleasantly that they take the smallpox here by way of diversion, the way they take the waters in other countries. This particular letter recounting the smallpox inoculation has received a great deal of popular fascination recently. On March 8th last month, for instance, Jeff Brumfeld ran a segment on NPR's All Things Considered, noting that Montague had her own children engrafted, and noting that Montague herself suffered the physical scars of a bout of smallpox in her youth. Brumfield moves beyond Montague's letters to describe her crusade to bring inoculation back to England. She met with a backlash that, in Brumfield's words, sound depressingly similar to the current pandemic. British and European physicians had heard of the procedure, but refused to believe it worked. Xenophobia and sexism, all too predictably, did their work. A procedure performed by Ottoman women, not described in medical texts, struck Montague's contemporaries as preposterous. Montague was aware of such prejudices. Towards the end of the same letter, Montague vows that she is patriot enough to bring knowledge of the practice back to England, and would even write British physicians about it, if I knew any of them that I thought had virtue enough to destroy such a considerable branch of their revenue for the good of mankind. I highlight this moment in Montague's travels for many reasons, not only because of this late pandemic moment of vaccinations and the threat of our 4th wave of COVID infections, but also because Montague presents the Great Books 305 student with a sharp critique of Enlightenment ideas in her own smooth-talking Horatian epistolary way. The very same medicines made possible by Francis Bacon's empirical methods also proved to be the profit motive of the same xenophobic physicians whom Montague chides. Like Voltaire, she holds a mirror up to the Enlightenment and finds the whole affair a little lackluster, despite her own benefiting from it. After a roster heavy with white male philosophers, and Milton no less, students found Montague's irreverent conversational tone refreshing. I taught Montague as one of several experimental texts in my Great Books 305 spread. I taught her alongside More's Utopia, Shakespeare's Tempest, Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World, which students particularly liked, by the way, Montague herself, of course, and Olaudah interesting narrative. Taught as part of this suite of texts, all in excerpts out of necessity, since Great Books 305 presents us with a voluminous spread of authors, Montague's letters allowed me to reframe the Great Books 305 theme of the modern worldview in a global context, with an eye towards the narratives of slavery and empire. Montague speaks as an imperial British subject looking on a different empire, an empire that governed no small segment of the world, and her perspective broadens the scope of the course and undergoes a kind of odyssey of its own. I'm going to return to that odyssey in a little bit, but first I have to step over to Great Books 306, where I experimented with Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft's change of tone likewise attracted my students' attention, and I'm not going to go into quite as much detail with Mary Wollstonecraft because my colleague, Ed Weintraub, has also taught her, and so he will give some different perspective on her. Namely, his perspective is going to address Wollstonecraft's relationship with what's going on the continent. Mine's going to be in a more British literature perspective. Nevertheless, Wollstonecraft makes sense in the context of Great Books 306 because, quite simply, she's a revolutionary. Snappy and sassy is what one of my students described her as. Her writings overbrim with passion for change. Wollstonecraft both brings the Enlightenment ideas to their natural conclusion and calls to reform the societies that the Enlightenment brought into being to begin with. Before I open this discussion, I always present my Great Books 306 classes with a handout in which I pair together a quotation from Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France and a quotation from Mary Wollstonecraft's 1790 Vindication of the Rights of Man. This Vindication of the Rights of Man was an essay that she wrote in response to Burke, and this essay formed the foundation of her later Vindication of the Rights of Woman. I'll present both quotations here, and then I'll discuss how I tie them to each other. Here's the Edmund Burke quotation. So Edmund Burke writes, "When ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, the loss cannot possibly be estimated. From that moment, we have no compass to govern us, nor can we know distinctly to what port we steer. Europe, undoubtedly, taken in mass, was in a flourishing condition on the day which your revolution was completed. How much of that preposterous state was owing to the spirit of our old manners and opinions is not easy to say. But as such causes cannot be indifferent to their operation, we must presume then, on the whole, that their operation was beneficial." That's the Edmund Burke quotation. Here's Mary Wollstonecraft's response. "I perceive from the whole tenor of your reflections that you have a mortal antipathy to reason. But if there is anything like argument or first principles in your wild declamation, behold the result. That we are to reverence the rust of antiquity and term the unnatural customs which ignorance has mistaken for self-interest, the sage fruit of experience. Nay, that if we do discover some errors, our feelings should lead us to excuse with blind love or unprincipled filial affection the venerable vestiges of ancient days. These are Gothic notions of beauty. The ivy is beautiful, but when it insidiously destroys the trunk from which it receives support, who would not grub it up?" The two quotations present a microcosm for many of the political debates that not only sprung into being during the Great Book's 306 age of reason and revolution, but also still rage today. Burke, the conservative, asks us what happens when a society destroys its traditional values, and Wollstonecraft, the progressive, counters that those same traditional values are the ivy strangling the tree. Her critique of Burke is that his entire argument rests on an appeal to tradition, which is a logical fallacy. Indeed, that same critique of patriarchal tradition emerges again and again in Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Tradition, in Wollstonecraft's view, forms a gilded cage, as she explains in chapter 3. She writes, "Women are everywhere in this deplorable state, for in order to preserve their innocence, as ignorance is courteously termed, truth is hidden from them, and they are made to assume an artificial character before their faculties have acquired any strength. Taught from their infancy that beauty is woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming about its gilt cage, only seeks to adorn its prison." Setting her sights on this tradition of beauty, the tradition equating a woman's worth to her looks, Wollstonecraft argues for expanding women's education. When my students wrote their discussion questions in response to this portion of the reading, many women in particular drew connections between Wollstonecraft's critiques and the still persistent traditions in the 21st century American culture that connect women's worth to their clothing, to their makeup, and to the shapes of their bodies. These are the kinds of connections that students could not make with other Great Book's 306 writers. Through her fiery style and forceful indictment, Wollstonecraft truly fulfilled the goal of a great book. She speaks across ages. When Wollstonecraft disparages Rousseau, and Ed Weintraub is going to tell us a bit more about that, she delivers a famous mockery of his thoughts on education. This mockery, in turn, has lived a curious afterlife as an online meme for social justice, a meme with which several of my students were familiar already before coming into the text. In chapter 9, Wollstonecraft quotes part of Rousseau. "Educate women like men," says Rousseau, "and the more they resemble our sex, the less power they will have over us." This, writes Wollstonecraft, is the very point I aim at. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. Truncated versions of this quotation have frequently been used by feminist thinkers on social media to show that at its roots, feminism is an egalitarian issue. As later feminist thinkers have pointed out, feminism has often fallen short of that egalitarian ideal. We only need to look at things such as the Seneca Falls Convention in the 19th century and the ways that the cause of abolition was sidelined in favor of white women's suffrage. But Wollstonecraft's spirit sets a high mark for what the age of revolution sought to be possible. In our own moment, with calls for racial justice, calls for closing the pay gap, calls for increased representation of women in STEM disciplines, for maternity leave, for changing the sexist traditions of beauty standards, Wollstonecraft has much to offer to a 21st century student. Montague does in her own more subtle ways. There is her famous description of a Turkish bathhouse that has become a milestone in queer history, in which Montague describes with more than an aesthetic appreciation, we shall say, the bodies of Turkish women. And Montague's own journey from an Anglo-centric to a more cosmopolitan worldview mirrors, in some ways, the journey that a student makes through the Great Books program as well, setting forth from her Ithaca, only to return home with new eyes. Finding herself in the parlors of her Effendi host, Ahmed Bey, Montague traverses spaces where women are permitted to speak to women as women, and where men dignify her conversation and her ideas with genuine interest, rather than as a marital trophy. It is no surprise that in one of her final letters, when she lands back home in Dover, she writes with a sigh that, since I must contend with our scanty allowance of daylight in England, I may forget the enlivening sun of Constantinople. Having seen a broader world, Montague recognizes that home is no longer home, and that modern though enlightened England may seem to be, a broader world is possible. I propose that these kinds of texts both broaden and deepen the scope of a Great Books discussion by communicating with one another as a tradition of women's writing that can interweave throughout the program, allowing students to draw on their own perspectives and on the perspectives of writers who critique what was given and what was taken for granted within their own eras. That, I propose, is the best way to lead students out of their allegorical cave. Thank you.
And thank you, Tom. Our next presenter is Kevin Hunnicutt.
Hi, I'm Kevin Honeycutt. I teach in the philosophy department with Charlie, and I also teach in the Great Books program, where I teach the 5th Great Books course, or at least until this year, when I'm teaching the second one. I've taught the 5th one for the past 5 or 6 years, like Tom. And that course begins with Shakespeare and ends with Hume, right? And there is a lot of philosophy in it. Other texts include Bacon, Descartes, Pascal, Newton, Hobbes, Locke, and then Milton, as Tom has suggested, gets kind of put in there. I may be forgetting someone, but I think that's all. So I've taught the course, as I said, for the past few years, and there are a couple of student comments that always reliably recur in course evaluations. Students ask why there's so much philosophy, which is a good question. They ask why there are no books written by women, which is another good question, and why there are no authors who could bring some type of cultural or ethnic or racial diversity or representation to the table, which is another good question. And my sense is that students have not been complaining so much about the books that we read as opposed, or as much as they are, shall we say, honestly wondering why we've chosen the particular ones that we have. And so a few years ago, I asked Brian Whitfield, who was the director then, if I could address this issue by using Montesquieu instead of Locke and Newton. And I'd be happy to talk in Q&A if anyone has more than sovereign indifference, if not contempt, as to why I substituted for those two. And I use Montesquieu's Persian Letters. So that's what I assigned instead of those two authors. Now, Montesquieu is a male aristocratic Frenchman, and this doesn't at first glance seem to address these student queries in any way concerning diversity or representation. But the Persian Letters itself, I would submit, does get at all of these issues, and more than elliptically, I would say. First, a word about the book itself. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the text, the Persian Letters is an epistolary novel with the additional literary conceit, at least I believe it's a conceit, that Montesquieu pretends to act as the translator for Persian men who had lodged with him. And this structure itself makes for interesting discussion, and not only due to the voyeuristic thrill of reading someone else's correspondence. Montesquieu explains in the reflections that serve as something of an epilogue to the piece a little bit about the text. And here's what he says. This is a quotation. In ordinary novels, digressions are permissible only when they themselves form a new story. Serious discussion has to be excluded. None of the characters having been introduced for purposes of discussion. It would be contrary to the nature, none of the characters having been introduced for purposes of discussion, it would be contrary to the nature and intention of the work. But in using the letter form, in which neither the choice of characters nor the subjects discussed have to fit with any preconceived intentions or plans, the author has taken advantage of the fact that he can include philosophy, politics, and moral discourse with the novel, and can connect everything together with a secret chain which remains, as it were, invisible. So one of the more interesting things about using this book is simply that one must work very hard to try to figure out even what is going on. Pascal generates a similar experience I found in terms of the reader having to try to put the puzzle pieces together. But the Persian Letters has an additional complexity in that the letters are authored by different people. And so students, in my experience anyway, have been very interested simply in trying to figure out who the characters are, what they want, whether they are reliable narrators, and so forth. And even though I excerpt the book, I wish I could teach the whole thing. There's a great deal to think through on this score, as interestingly enough, excerpting does not really change the fundamental way that the Persian Letters is experienced, which is discretely, C-R-E-T-E, and discontinuously. The characters, in other words, are always partial and obscured to the reader due to the epistolary format itself. Now, as to the female drama, to use a Platonic turn of phrase, because the novel concerns what happens at a seraglio when the owner is away, when the master, Uzbek, is away, much of the dramatic action concerns the status of the female characters in the book. Although the majority of the letters are written by men, some key ones are written by women. The third letter of all is written by one of the wives, Zashi, who chides the master Uzbek for leaving. In letter 62, another wife named Zealous complains about having to raise a daughter in the environment of the seraglio and about the strange texture of the relationship between men and women in general. Uzbek's favorite wife, Roxana, writes only 3 letters, if I'm not mistaken, including the final, very shocking one. And in them, among other things, she discusses subjects such as the immodesty of French women and her own attitudes towards Uzbek. Classroom discussions of such letters almost always engages notions of female identity, of subordination and consent, of gender roles, and so forth. And although Montesquieu is of course the actual author of the letters, the conceit that some of them are written by women and many of them are written about women opens up the text and opens up discussion in ways that doesn't easily occur in, for instance, like Bacon's Do Organon or something. And in terms of diversity in general, the Persian Letters has it, whatever one would like to mean by it. The men who watch the wives are eunuchs, so sometimes students raise questions about whether they're real men, whether they occupy an intermediate gendered space between Uzbek and the wives, and so forth. At least one of the eunuchs is black. He is called the chief black eunuch in translation. At any rate, and at least one of the women in the seraglio is not Persian, but Indian. And there's an enormous range of topics in the letters themselves. There are letters that concern the difference between Christianity and Islam, between French and Persian culture, and between Catholicism and Protestantism. There are letters about modesty and immodesty, mathematics, translating Horace, fashion, coffee houses, international law. There are arguments for feminism and against religious intolerance, for polygamy, and against suicide. There are letters concerning Judaism and Hinduism, the perfections of God, monasticism, and magic spells. There are letters that discuss literary reviews, assassination, alchemy, castration, finance, libraries, and Swedish queens. There are letters about the African slave trade and about the Roman slave system, about depression, and about anthologies. In short, the book, like Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, seems to somehow address everything and does an especially good job of showing a topic against the backdrop of something else, and particularly something else that appears at first glance and perhaps even upon deeper inspection, to be unrelated. So in short, and my remarks are relatively short because I'm happy to answer anything in Q&A. But in short, I recommend using the Persian Letters for this type of exercise in a seminar format if one is trying to get subjects to wrestle with difference and to depart from the normal course of events when discussing the rise of modernity in Europe. I mean, the course, as Tom has rightly pointed out, is called The Modern Worldview. And so one of the questions I always put on the table is, what does it mean to be modern? What is it that we're discussing, the modern worldview? The Persian Letters helps, as Jim said, problematize this notion of modernity. Now, it goes without saying, so of course I'll say it, that books can hit or miss for any number of reasons. But in my experience, this book has hit much more than it has missed. And it has served the purpose of a great books class, or at least my purpose in a great books class, which is simply to get people talking about ideas from authors that are smarter than they are. So, and in the end, I mean, maybe Montesquieu wouldn't even care if your students won't like it. I mean, as he says in the preface to the book, he's not interested in defending its merits. He says, quote, "People will read it if it's good, and if it's bad, I don't care whether they read it or not." And I guess those are suitable words to end the presentation on as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Our last presenter tonight before our time of conversation is Ed Weintraub.
Hi, I'm Ed Weintraub. I am a professor of German at Mercer University, and I am currently working on East German, not contemporary East German novelists, especially with their portrayal of Jews and Sinti minorities in Berlin. But tonight, I'm not talking about East German literature, contemporary East German literature. I want to talk about what I have done recently, or not recently, for quite some time over in Great Books 307. I've been teaching this course entitled Reason and Revolution regularly since the turn of the century. The first 3 times I taught the course, I confined myself largely to works that were recommended in Mercer's Great Book curriculum. While preparing for the 4th iteration of the course, I realized that the curriculum did not do justice to one of the seminal events of the 18th century, the French Revolution. More importantly, though, in the prior 2 classes, students made me painfully aware of another shortcoming in our curriculum. As I reviewed my syllabus with them on the first day of class, several students grumbled, "Great, another Great Books course without any female writers." The same criticism found its way into written student evaluations of the course at the end of the semester. And so for the 4th iteration of the course, I decided to address both of these concerns by making 3 significant changes to my reading list. As usual, the semester started off with Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? This essay offers a reflection on the 2 themes advertised in the title of the course, Reason and Revolution. First, Kant submits that we can emerge from self-imposed immaturity by having the courage to use our reason. Second, he submits that revolution can overthrow autocratic despotism, but it can never truly reform a manner of thinking. Variations on these themes play themselves out in the works that constitute the first half of the course. Goethe's Faust, Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations, Kant's Groundwork for a Metaphysics of Morals, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and Hamilton and Madison's The Federalist Papers. At this point in the semester, after having explored the operation of reason and the possible consequences of revolution in 18th century discourse, I added 2 new works to my reading list that had not been adopted into the Great Books tradition, into the Great Books canon. Montague's Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, written in 1791, and Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, written in 1792. The ensuing discussion of the French Revolution and proto-feminism was followed by a study of works by Romantic poets and Charles Baudelaire, culminating with a reading of the 3rd new work I added to my reading list, Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. The semester ended with a discussion of reason and revolution in Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto and Darwin's Origin of Species. Let me now explain the rationale for the selection of the three texts. Olympe de Gouges was arguably the most passionate advocate for women's rights in revolutionary France. Born in 1748, in her 30s and 40s, she wrote over 24 plays, including the first French drama to portray a Black slave as a protagonist. And in the wake of the French Revolution, she authored over 70 pamphlets on a variety of social, cultural, and political issues, such as the abolition of slavery and the death penalty, and the need for civil rights of illegitimate children and unmarried mothers. In her most noteworthy work, de Gouges took issue with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, promulgated by an assembly of males in August 1789. Over the next 2 years, this declaration underwent several amendments, such as extending civil and political rights to Jews and to Blacks in the colonies. But it continued to neglect the interest of half the population, women. In response to this oversight, in 1791, de Gouges published her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, in which she excoriated men for being, quote, bizarre, blind, bloated with learning, and degenerated into the crassest ignorance in this century of enlightenment and wisdom. As you can see, meekness and humility are not her strong suits. In her dedication to Marie Antoinette, de Gouges urged the Queen to use her influence to advance women's rights, stating, quote, the revolution will be achieved only when all women are convinced of their deplorable lot and of the rights that they have lost in society, unquote. In the body of the pamphlet, de Gouges amended the male declaration in such a way that would bring an end to the exploitation and marginalization of half of humanity. She concluded by exhorting women to, quote, wake up, the alarm bell of reason is heard throughout the universe, know your rights, unquote. Admittedly, the strident, indignant tone that permeates this declaration lacks philosophical rigor or rhetorical sophistication, but it is the first and only pamphlet of the French Revolution to champion so uncompromisingly the forgotten rights of women. Due to her deference to the monarchy and her seditious pamphlets, de Gouges fell victim to the guillotine in 1793, a punishment that, according to one obituary, was in part for forgetting her proper place and proper role as a woman. When discussing de Gouges pamphlets in class, I prepare a handout in which the original Declaration of Rights of Man is displayed. And let me show you this if you don't mind. I'm going to share my screen. Can all of you see that? Okay, so I set this up so that the original declaration written by men is on the left-hand side, and de Gouges declaration is paragraph by paragraph on the right-hand side. And this makes it a whole lot easier for students to compare and contrast the merits and limitations of both documents. So once they get done discussing the comparisons and contrasts between the two documents, students then debate the merits of de Gouges' appended social contract between the man and the woman, which is even today rather a provocative statement, and it's one that students really enjoy reading for its very provocative statements. Immediately after discussing the import of de Gouges' declaration, we move on to Mary Wollstonecraft. So Wollstonecraft was born in 1759, and she had decided before turning 30 to abandon her employment as a governess and to pursue a career as a full-time writer. Her first book on the education of women was followed by 2 volumes, each of which emerges from her keen interest in the developments of the French Revolution. First, A Vindication of the Rights of Man, as Thomas already noted, written in 1790, and A Vindication of the Rights of Women, written in 1792. There is no evidence that she had read or was even aware of de Gouges' declaration, even though Wollstonecraft had moved to Paris in 1792 and had remained there until 1795 in order to become more informed about the causes and effects of the French Revolution. The impetus for her vindication of the rights of women came not from Olympe de Gouges, but from a different Frenchman, Talleyrand, the politician and diplomat who was instrumental in shaping the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Wollstonecraft dedicated her book to Talleyrand, taking issue with his defense of a society in which, quote, women are to be excluded without having a voice, unquote. And she laments this flaw in the new Constitution will forever show that man must, in some shape, act like a tyrant, and tyranny, in whatever form of society it rears its brazen front, will ever undermine morality. What follows in her book is a masterful analysis of the shortcomings of contemporary patriarchal society, in which Wollstonecraft admonishes her contemporaries for their immaturity and childish behaviors, while promoting the virtues of reason, friendship, and modesty. She hopes that, quote, the divine rights of husbands, like the divine rights of kings, may in this enlightened age be contested without danger, unquote. And she implores men to, quote, snap the chains and be content with the rational fellowship of women instead of slavish obedience, unquote. Her arguments culminate in the call for women to exercise their reason. That's a famous passage. It is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore them to their lost dignity, and make women labor by reforming themselves to reform the world. And her call for action is somewhat tempered, though, by the concession that she does not wish women to have power over men, but power over themselves. Our discussion of Deguge and Wollstonecraft takes about 3 days, during which students usually draw connections between these works and the works that they had read previously. The influence of these two female authors continues to be felt over subsequent weeks. When exploring romantic poetry, I include one of my favorite poems by Joseph von Eichendorff, German romantic, entitled Yearning. And once again, I'd like to share this with you so you can read along with me. And here we go. That's not it. Doesn't look like Eichendorff at all. There we go.
I think it might have changed on your screen, but not ours. You have to unshare and
Well,
reshare.
thank you. Let me stop share and try this again. How about now? Can you see it?
The stars are so golden and gleaming.
Yes. Okay. So the stars are so golden and gleaming, as here by the window I stand. And I hear from the distant hills streaming the sound of a horn through the land. My heart burns with longing to wander, and secretly think at the sight, oh, I wish I could be with them yonder in the glorious summer night. I see two journeymen springing with joy as they wander along, and I hear them as boisterously singing, they banish the silence with song. Of dizzying summits of mountains where treetops rustle so light, of cliffs and of crags where mountains plunge down through the forest night. Of statues in darkening bowers where gardens from hillsides were hewn, of wild-growed hedges and flowers, of palaces lit by the moon, of windows where fair maidens listen when the tones of the lute invite, and waters that murmur and glisten in this glorious summer night. This poem features a common trope of German Romanticism, gleeful men wandering through nature, singing about their experiences. But I draw your attention to the final strophe, where the men sing about women standing at a window, listening to men singing. What makes this work significant in my eyes is that the narrator of this poem is a girl who is evidently unable to leave the domestic sphere. Notice that she secretly thinks about being with these men, these wanderers, and who is vicariously enthralled about the experiences that the men are able to enjoy, but perhaps women are not. The window is thus something that confines as well as invites, a seemingly porous barrier between the domestic and the public realms. Enter Gustave Flaubert. If you are familiar at all with Madame Bovary, you know that the novel references windows numerous times. I've counted over 36 instances, and in many of these, it is Emma Bovary who is standing at a window, musing about what she has either lost or what she wishes she could obtain. Emma's persistent complaints about the limitations of being a woman and her increasing predilection to adopt masculine behaviors and clothing illuminate the societal and cultural problems that both Deguge and Wollstonecraft highlight. Students are generally quick to make a number of insightful conclusions to the works discussed earlier in the semester. For example, the characters in the novel seem to confirm Adam Smith's observation that we address ourselves not to the humanity of others, but to their self-love. Kant's promise of man's emergence from self-imposed immaturity has not come to fruition, but Wollstonecraft's warning about the pernicious effects of romance novels on impressionable young women is painfully evident. Several students have suggested that Flaubert's Madame Bovary is a litmus test for the hopes and fears of de Gouges and Wollstonecraft, and I've received several exceptional final papers in which these connections are creatively and persuasively explored. So in conclusion, in my Great Books 306 course, Reason and Revolution, students have welcomed the opportunity to trace the trajectory of reason from Kant through Darwin and to understand the consequences of the American and French revolutions. More than anything, though, they appreciate the inclusion of female voices into the Great Books curriculum, voices that challenge and rectify the dominant male discourse, be these voices heard directly from women like de Gouges and Wollstonecraft, or indirectly through male authors like Eichendorff and Flaubert. Fini.
Thanks, Ed. We have a good chunk of time for some conversation, and I think we're all on the same screen. So there are a couple of ways that I'll ask you to participate in doing that. One is to use the feature in Zoom for raise hand. Many of you will find that under the participants tab at the bottom. Some of you with a different version of Zoom, it may be under the reactions. But also, if you have a quick comment in response to something that you'd like to jump in, if you'll just wave furiously, I'll go ahead and recognize you. And that way we will have a chance to have a bit freer conversation. So who wants to start us out?
I can start.
Great, thanks.
Okay, there was a lot here, so I'm gonna have to get my brain back to what Jim was talking about with the poetry. So I'm gonna go all the way back to the beginning with Jim. But one of my questions is poetry. We've been fighting to get poetry back in the curriculum and have it be loved by students. There's always going to be those students that love poetry. They come in loving poetry, they leave loving poetry. But most of the students will always come in, and like he said, they're always going to come in with this question of, why do I want to read poetry? I don't understand it. It's very frustrating to me. So they leave really getting nothing out of it. And it is hard for the teacher because, we want them to get all of the feels that we're getting from the poetry, and they're just not getting it. And so my question, though, is as we move forward in society and we try to include a diversity of forms in poetry into the great books, and we want to teach them more, do you feel like I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. Okay, let me back up a minute. Psychologically, we don't like to be alone with our thoughts right now in our modern world, and that's a huge problem. So poetry is the one thing that students read that kind of brings in all of those inner feelings just because of its subjective understanding. So we come to poetry, the author can mean one thing by it, but then we have the subjective understanding because we bring our own perspective. And so a lot of times we get our own meaning out of it. So therefore it kind of dives into that well of internal emotional stress. And so because of that, though, with the whole society movement of us not wanting to be alone with ourselves, I mean, we've got that joke that says that we can't even use the bathroom without a cell phone now, right? So we have this situation where we always have to have other people talking to us and being around us, and poetry makes us think about things in this emotional way. Do you think that it's more of a psychological problem that we're not getting the poetry in, or do you think that it's really just that we're lacking forms and that the students are connecting that way? Do you think that it's more deeper than that? Like it needs to be approached differently? Or, I mean, is there a chance for poetry? Because this is something that's kind of been on my heart a lot, and I'm just wondering what you think of it.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I was trying to write down so much here to talk about, but My experience, and again, I mean, this is what I was trained to do. So I come in with lots of enthusiasm, and I might sometimes just blow by their indifference sometimes. But one thing that comes up quite a bit when we were teaching, when I was discussing poetry in this class, Reason and Revolution, but also just poetry in general, is usually students, when they encounter a poem, at the beginning, the thing they like is it's relatable. I don't know if you hear this word a lot, relatable. And it just drives me nuts, because I say, I don't want to know what it's like to be me. I'm myself all the time. And so one of the sort of things that we see when we start reading poems by these people who are either long dead, or people who have vastly different experiences than ours, the students start to feel like, oh, it's not just about seeing what I'm like, but it's also seeing what other people are like. And that connection, though we're always with our phones and we're always connected to people through Facebook or what have you, we don't have much meaningful connection sometimes. And so I mentioned Derek Walcott earlier, the St. Lucian poet, writing about his ambivalence towards the English language that has, or England that has harmed his country so much, but also this English tongue that he loves in A Far Cry from Africa. And students who grew up in Macon or Pennsylvania or wherever, all of a sudden they'd be able to sort of embody that ambivalence. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question exactly, as sort of inhabiting some of the thoughts that you presented me with. Do you have a follow-up, or am I on the right track?
You kind of are, yeah. I mean, you are right. Poetry can be really relatable. And so I get what you're saying, that because poetry is so relatable, not only do we get something, we recognize our own thoughts and feelings, but also we empathize with others. And I totally get that you're saying that. But I guess what I'm saying is if we're pushing, say, to move it into more of the great books curriculum, it's really important. We have to, I guess, diagnose why out of all the forms of writing, it's kind of fell off the wagon. And that is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And so I guess my question was whether or not you thought that it was more of a psychological thing, that we can't be alone with our thoughts, or that we don't want to address our own personal thoughts, that it's more like a counseling session with ourselves to read poetry in a way, whereas narration kind of feels a little bit distant still. And I was just wondering if you thought that might be some of the reason, and if that needs to be addressed in order to get poetry back into the center where it should be, into the popular table, where the other guys are sitting,
I will say that it's been interesting in this is my first time teaching great books. I've said that so many times this semester to my students, they're sick of it. But I say you have to introduce me to this. And so when I bring in the poetry, I was a little shy at first, and very conscious of, yeah, of course I'm going to love poetry. But they have responded to it in ways that I've been very surprised by. They've said they want more poetry. We just finished Keats today. We had put him away for a little while because we really got into Pride and Prejudice, and I said, okay, we need more days on this. I'm so biased, but my experience when I'm teaching in great books or INT is that when students actually get to read poetry, they really do respond to it. In INT, I teach in both programs, I should say. We read Jericho Brown's Bullet Points, which is, a poem that begins, Jericho Brown's African-American. He says, if I'm ever found dead anywhere near a police officer, that police officer did it. And so reading this sort of very emotionally charged poem, the students were just like, oh my God, this is what poetry is? I didn't know. I thought it was, I don't know what they think it is.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
a follow-up question would be, when we look at the great books, we're looking at poetry with Homer, and we're looking at poetry from say Pope, even if we go all the way up. And so that type of poetry, well, Pope is more human nature connected, but if we go all the way back down to Homer, let's go all the way back. That type of poetry is not as, the great books type of poetry is not as connected to human nature as the poetry that we read now. Say, like if you read Wilbur compared to, the great books type. And so I'm trying to think of all the poetry I've read, but I'm just drawing a blank about the old poets. But yeah, it's a different type, right? Like it would be hard to get the same reactions out of students from Homer than it would be from Wilbur.
Yeah, that's why my argument is sort of for the lyric, because that's the emotionally charged poem. And I mean, I like narrative poetry. I recognize I'm in the South, which is also the land of narrative poetry, and you can have very emotionally charged narrative poetry. But Sappho might be someone to consider, in that section. And as we start to move up towards, I think, certainly the age of ambivalence and reason and revolution, the lyric is probably a little bit more prominent. I don't know, maybe probably modernism. I don't know, wrecked the narrative. You can no longer, once T.S. Eliot writes The Wasteland, this sort of narrative, this great story, it's gone. And that might be actually an advantage because the lyric is there. Again, I don't know if I'm quite answering your question though.
No, it's good. We can go on to somebody else, but thank you so much for talking about it. I have a lot to think on, so I really appreciate that.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Well,
Amy.
I'd love to continue it.
We'll get Charlie in and then Stephanie.
I'm really glad you mentioned Sappho. I'm on the Great Books 1 committee, and she's just the no-brainer. She was the easy one. As we were chatting before the first meeting started, we agreed that Sappho needed to be added to Great Books 1. But I really wanted to sort of respond to Kevin, although I'm really interested in anybody's responses. But because we've talked about this, in fact, several of us have talked about this, so it really is an open question. But Kevin's paper triggered it for me. I am committed to, obviously, to this project of adding, authors that are women and people of color to the program. And there are lots of reasons for that. But one of those is that I want our curriculum, as much as possible, to reflect the diversity of our students and the ways that our students think of themselves when they're thinking about diversity. So I want there to be representation that is responsive to their understanding of diversity. But I'm also really interested in the way that othering happens in the tradition that across different lines than are drawn in the contemporary world. And so the Montague is an interesting case of this. In the Great Books 1 class, we're thinking about Herodotus. Now, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, is he a white guy? It depends on what you think white is. Even whiteness and blackness, right? These aren't fixed categories. These are things that the way that they're defined now are very important, and I'm not trying to diminish that as an important part of our concern and of contemporary discourse. But there was no such thing as African Americans in the 6th century BC, but there were marginalized communities, and there were ethnic differences that had cultural weight, power, that created divisions and framed the way that people understood each other's place in society or how we were to interact with them. So I guess this is, I shouldn't buttonhole Kevin too much. This is really for everybody, but I wonder how we do that, right? One, working on, in a sense, it's not super easy work, but I really think it's the easier part of this work to sort of work where we can achieve some sort of representation of what we consider now to be the important categories of diversity. But how do we sort of, within the Great Books program, how do we also do this other thing and say, even if our contemporary categories aren't the same as the ones that existed in other moments in history in other places, that this dynamic of othering has been around a long time, and it is a part of our tradition. And I guess that's the last part of my question. I think, look, just to be provocative, but just to not linger too long, when our students read Hebrew Bible, or let's just say New Testament, if they're not identifying with the Romans, they're out of their minds, right? So that's a document of othering, right? There's we were once slaves, is the narrative of the Passover, right? It's and so we can go. How do we get there though? How do we make the othering that's already in the tradition and meaningful in terms of framing our experience visible as such and activate that conversation?
I think Tom has a response.
So I think a part of this, Charlie, involves the way that we use historical context. So to pinpoint the topic of race in particular and Great Books 305, the modern worldview, one of the other writers I teach who's not a strictly canonical Great Books writer is Olala Equiano. When Equiano writes from the perspective of an Afro-Caribbean British person, he identified nationally as a British person, he's doing so with an eye towards the fact that by the time he enters the scene, the category of race has assumed these legal and economic dimensions that it did not have in the 6th century. In other words, in order to have any kind of meaningful conversation about race, particularly in the context of Great Books 305, which is the era of European colonialism, we have to bring in some kind of historical context and show to what degree race assumes new meanings over time. And those meanings necessarily have to be outside of the text as well. So a part of this involves using good scholarly texts such as the Broadview editions and so forth, and getting students to engage with the actual editorial material in that. So yes, I realize that there are schools of Great Books thought that would balk at bringing in historical context, but I would propose that if we are to take this project meaningfully as a project of bringing in other voices and actually questioning and critiquing the dominant narrative, then history is indispensable here. It's easy for us to hand wave race as a social construct without realizing that, yes, it's a social construct, but it also had a meaningful, tactile, tangible economic impact on the lives of actual human beings who lived. And Equiano would be one instance of that. The women writers whom we brought in also would be other instances of that. As Ed points out, Mary Wollstonecraft had to abandon a career as a governess in order to be a writer to begin with. This would not even be a consideration for a male writer at all. So history counts. That would be my.
Oh, history counts 100%. And I promise, Brian, I won't talk very long, but it's important, though, that we recognize the power of the Great Books pedagogy, and we find ways to bring in the context and to set up these questions and to give the students the resources they need without, while at the same time, embracing this sort of encouraging this idea that we are sitting there with the texts in a way, seeing what we can see shoulder to shoulder, and that expertise has a less powerful role over us in those moments than they do in other classrooms, even though other classrooms are important and good. And the way we can do that, the way we can do what you're talking about without, I think, doing violence to the pedagogy, is to really create some robust co-curricular events. That is I would prefer that you stand up and give a lecture and we all go to it as we require it of our students and encourage it strongly of our faculty, and we go do that, and then go read Equiano in the classroom with a question and without leaning on the expertise of the scholarly apparatus or the editorial voice of authority, because that so history absolutely 100% matters, but I think we have to think about how we do that in the Great Books program. And since it's harder, we can't do it on the nose the way you can do it in a disciplinary course without changing the dynamic in the classroom in a way that risks diminishing the power of the pedagogy. And so that's our challenge. The challenge is to do exactly what you're talking about, but in structures that don't that don't vitiate the power and what actually can be good about the Great Books approach.
Thanks. One last comment from Tom, and then we'll move to Stephanie. Go ahead, Tom.
I think to add to Charlie's point here, another thing that's worth noting is the degree to which the canonical Great Books texts already talk about these issues. And again, highlighting race in particular, Francis Bacon has several essays on plantations. William Shakespeare comments on the slave trade in oblique ways that would be easy to overlook unless you actually showed a light upon them. Hobbes highlights slavery as well, and of course, John Locke. So if we're going to bring these new voices in, we have to make sure that the other texts are oriented in such a fashion where we're showing that they already had these issues in mind, even if those issues don't seem to be necessarily to the forefront.
Thanks, Tom. Stephanie.
I'm willing to defer to Paige or Kevin if it's all along these same veins, because I'm kind of going in a different direction.
All right, Paige or Kevin.
I'll follow the train. Thank you, Stephanie, for giving me your spot in line. But again, I see your point, Charlie, and what Tom is saying. And I admire the rigor and the tradition of historically working through great works over time, but sometimes, and maybe your extracurricular activities could help with this, Charlie. Sometimes it seems to me that you're just going to have to leap forward and get out of chronological order to get validity into talking about slavery. Go ahead and and work with African American writers, and then jump back and pick up your historical antecedents. Is that just not allowed, or is that gonna?
It's totally not allowed. It's totally. But the thing that we can do, Paige, because I agree with you about this stuff. The thing is that this is not. These students are taking other classes. When I teach the Republic in Great Books 2, I sit on my hands and I bite the inside of my mouth, but I understand that the kind of sorry, I'm talking too much. Okay, very briefly. I understand that the kind of power that these students have not had, that kind of power in a classroom before, where the person who sits in the seat of power cedes it. Not to just anything, what do you feel about this? But in a very rigorous way says, what do you see? And then holds you accountable. Where do you see that? Right? And creates that context where nobody, professor, student, nobody is allowed to bring in evidence that's not right in front of everybody. And when you can really hold that line, there's a kind of intellectual courage and empowerment that happens that in my experience doesn't happen in any other kind of classroom situation. So I know when I teach the Republic in Great Books that I just wrote a friggin' book on it, right? They're gonna miss so much, but who they're gonna become at the end of that class, knowing that what they've done in that spectacularly hard book, and the courage that they'll take with them to the next hard book that they face, it's worth them missing aspects of the cave. It's worth it. And so we got to find other ways to get that perspective to them without disrupting that magic of empowering them with these books.
Yes.
I certainly did. Just a quick response. I certainly believe in that in that sacred space of the student and the text right there. I guess I'm just not quite as wedded to this one and then this one and then this one. Then do an extracurricular thing on poetry of the Harlem Renaissance that reflects on slavery, or do Frederick Douglass, What to a Slave is the 4th of July. Do it as a special lecture outside of class, but do it. I mean, this is, and I was not trained in African-American lit at all. I mean, zip. And I'm still a beginner, but you can't do without it anymore. You just can't do without it. And there's so many wonderful things. If you want lyric poetry, do some Claude McKay, do some Harlem Renaissance poets. There's got to be a way to solve this problem with core text courses that are rigorous the way you all have it. And I admire it. I'm just chafing a little bit at the being able to do. You got to do it all, right? You have to do what you're doing, and you have to do that other stuff too, somehow.
Ed has a comment, and then Amy has a comment.
I forgot to unmute myself. I wanted to respond to what Paige and Charlie were just saying. I'm wondering out loud right now. In grade books 1, 2, and 3, maybe even 4, students are trained to develop habits in reading a text closely and to call out of that as much as possible as the instructor sits on his or her hands and bites her teeth and tongue, trying not to lead them on. When the students, however, get to be juniors and seniors and are taking grade books 5, 6, and 7, is that a time to expect more of them, and that they no longer are expected not to diverge from the text in front of them, but to bring in knowledge which they've culled elsewhere, or knowledge that the professor can impart to them in a short capsule-like fashion? Is there a division there between the lower level grade books courses and the pedagogy that has to be there, and the pedagogy that we might want to experiment with in the upper division courses?
I would say really quickly, one of the things I see is my experience is they tend to bring in what they've learned, not only in great books, but the rest of their curriculum, and have conversations that, because of that, are already doing some of that work without me necessarily having to provide an impetus for it. I mean, today, this is in Great Books 4, our first day on Don Quixote, we're having this conversation about chivalry. And all I said was, well, what if we take out the word chivalry and we put in the word privilege? And it was like, I mean, it was a great conversation about in what ways do we think of honor, but how is that, how does that function? I mean, they know all of these other things that are going on, and they're part of their reading of the text. So I think Amy had a comment as well.
This is for Charlie and Paige. I was thinking about, I understand what you're saying. You want to get the context in there without taking away the empowerment of the student with the text, but at the same time, being able to give that to them in a way that doesn't dilute what you're doing in the classroom in a controlled manner that makes sense, right? And I think that there's like, if you like dive into the literature of what happened when we took history. So like, they didn't have this problem back in the day. History was always included in the curriculum. It was included in the curriculum inside every single subject. So what happened is, and I think, I don't know, around the 1950s or 70s, something like that, they ripped history out of the curriculum and then made it its own subject. And what happened is then there became this huge disconnect between history and every other subject that we were teaching, and nobody knew what was going on anymore. And so lately, we've tried to integrate history back into the curriculum. So across the curriculum, we know what we're talking about again. And this is still dealing with that disconnect, I think. So back in the day, you wouldn't have students that didn't understand where these people were coming from, that didn't understand the culture in those Roman days, because they already had, the history was all connected with everything that they had always been learning. And so now we have these students who are like these newborn babies that come in and they're like, well, I don't understand this context, or they're understanding it wrong. You really want them to have that power with the text, but you're finding yourself adding things in that aren't even in the text, and then you're having to explain where it comes from, and it is difficult. And I have like, I don't know, I've tried all kinds of things, you know, and really I think the best thing that you could do maybe is just to ask interpretive questions, get them to ask their own interpretive questions and really think on the text and have a discussion about it. And that might lead them to kind of looking it up on their own. But there's only so much leading we can do if we really want to empower them with the text. And I think that's a thing. So, but yeah, look up the literature on history and what we're doing with it, because it is a mess. Like it's just a lot there. So
Thanks, Amy. Kevin and Stephanie both have had their hands up for a while. So maybe Stephanie, if you want to lead the direction, or Kevin, are you still along the same vein? Kevin, you're muted, I think. Yeah.
The mute thing doesn't show up, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Kevin.
Now you are muted, but we can't hear. No.
Ah,
I guess that means it's my turn.
I guess it means it's Stephanie's turn. Yes.
Well, I can tie in with what you're saying here, and I can get this information from one or more of you at another time, but I just want to get clear. You have 6 or 7 Great Books courses in a sequence?
We have 7, yes.
And what's the size of your student body, or the students that take this? Is this just the honors students, or?
No, Great Books is open to any student in the college. When students come in, they choose either Great Books or the integrative track, which is a more distributional model.
So how many students do you have, and how many faculty serve them?
I'll let Charlie chime in. She knows the current numbers better than I do.
I'm not sure I have the precise numbers for you, Stephanie, but we graduate about 40 a year. The program starts larger. We don't need to get into the weeds here, but we offer lots and lots of sections of Great Books 1 and 2 because students can transfer out without losing any time for graduation. And then the program gets smaller. So by the time they're in these courses in the junior and senior year, we typically run 2 or 3 sections a year of each course. And so we'll have cohorts of anywhere from, 35 in a really small cohort to 60 in a big cohort.
So I'm just really envious of all the luxurious time you have to teach your Great Books courses. So I'm from a college that we have 40 faculty, and we're all core faculty that only teach Great Books and only focus on honor students taking these classes. And our incoming class is usually around 2,500 students a year. So we we've thought through a lot of these things in a different way. And I have to agree with Amy and Paige that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I would say that one of the ways that we've tried to deal with this, whether you provide historical context or not, is to provide a very little that just kind of sets the stage a little, even if it's just some of the preface material that one might find in a Norton anthology, or some of our faculty have written 1 or 2 pages to contextualize early Christianity, but nothing that's real heavy-handed. And if it is a little bit more heavy-handed than some of us want it to be, we give it to them maybe after class instead of ahead of class, or we challenge it and say what problems we think there are in this contextualization and how it itself introduces bias. I think back in the day, maybe you could control what students know, but if you don't provide them something, they can go find it on Google themselves, and then you don't know what they're getting, and you don't have that foundation in common. So we also do a chronological thing, or largely chronological, but in allegiance with Paige, we are allowed to occasionally pair a chronological piece with an asynchronous piece for a good pedagogical reason. We still keep the overarching chronological arc, but we occasionally pair and have like a mini arc of, here's like a mini arc of something in a class or a week, but always drawing attention to it in a way that still serves our other goals. And with a group as committed and with as much time as you have, and I'm sure you will continue to sort out what works for you. But I would I'd love to talk to some of y'all some more at another time, because I am scared to death of poetry. I mean, I'm fine with the Iliad and some of these other things that I've taught, that big kind of poetry, but the lyric poetry and some of these others, I could use some good recommendations on. I envy my colleagues who can manage to teach meaningful classes with a few pages of poetry, and my students are reading 60 pages of text, and then they whine about how demanding I am. But yeah, I just love this conversation, and I wish I could say more, but I want to give Kevin a chance if he can get his mute off.
All right. Kevin, we'll give you a shot. We cannot hear you.
Maybe you can put it in the chat box,
You can,
Kevin.
yeah, you can come over to my office, Kevin. You're right next door. So I didn't mean, I'm just steal a moment. I didn't mean all or nothing at all, Stephanie. I think it's just harder when I'm teaching in a philosophy class and I'm teaching Plato, I could just say what I want them to hear. When I'm teaching Plato in a great book seminar, I have to sit there and figure out how to get them to what I want them to get to. And so it's all there, but it's just harder.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a puzzle. All right, I'm gonna step aside for Kevin to come talk.
I don't know how I gave my paper. Now it doesn't work apparently. I don't know.
Oh wait, here.
Do I need
Yeah,
these?
because that's where the microphone is right now.
Okay.
Sorry.
What about now? All right, at least I could give my paper. Yeah, just in response to a couple of things. I mean, Charlie's point about how the tradition takes up these things, I think Herodotus is a good choice. Someone like Josephus or Livy. I mean, a lot of historians, Josephus is kind of already looking at some of these issues from the inside, maybe. So, I mean, there are texts in the tradition that take up some of these concepts, and the trick is just working them in. I mean, it'd be nice if Livy and Tacitus and Mercy, Otis Warren, and Germaine de Stael, I mean, Colette, it'd be nice if all these people were in the curriculum, and maybe they should be, but I mean, part of our problem is always just trying to find space. But I do think there are places in the curriculum for where some of these older conversations have been had. I mean, as far as context, I tend to err on the side of not very much. I mean, for me, context, it's like con queso, right? I mean, it's supposed to go with it, right? So, I mean, context can't like explain away the text. And I think the difficulty that some students and professors have, I mean, one of my friends had to get out of the Great Books program because she just couldn't handle like not being the expert, right? It just drove her nuts. Like, she says, I don't know anything about these books. I said, yeah, that's fine. And she just couldn't handle it's not what she was pedagogically used to, right? What happened when I was a freshman is that we did get context, but it wasn't in the classroom. So it was kind of what Charlie was talking about. And this would be nice to revive if we had the time. I mean, as there was a lecture series, I remember my freshman year at Mercer, every week a professor gave a talk on one of the great books, and typically a great book that students were reading in Great Books 1. So I remember lectures on Euclid. I remember lectures on Thucydides, on the Republic. I still have the notes for these things. And so that was very helpful to have that contextual framing of an hour for a work that we were reading by someone who knew what they were talking about. And then to go back to the classroom. And then because all the students had to listen to the lecture, that was very helpful. Then it's all something that we share. Whereas right now, you know, Tom and I both teach Great Books 305, even if we teach the same books. You know, when context starts coming in, the experience is no longer totally shared. That's always what I'm hesitant about. I agree that it's important to frame some of these things, but I also agree, I think, with Charlie that it's harder for us to watch the students maybe mess it up, but it's good for them to maybe mess it up. So anyway, I think this is a good conversation though, and it's interesting to hear how other places have worked with these problems with different scales and different numbers of students. But maybe that's the solution, or a solution, is that we have context, but the context is shared amongst all the students, and maybe is much more to the point for all parties concerned. You know.
Then we can watch them get the lectures wrong about the books that they're getting.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But anyway, I really like this conversation. It's things I've thought about too. One of the professors is missing and his hand is up. It's ridiculous. I better go check on him. Hold on just a second. So.
Thanks, Kevin. We have about 10 minutes left. So if there are some other comments, directions we'd like to go. Interestingly, I would say, Jim, the one time I taught 407, I actually added back some Yeats poems, and we even started the semester the first day before they'd read anything. I just came in and handed them the Second Coming, and we started the semester well with that as our framework. And then periodically we'd come back to Yeats. And so that was a helpful way to do some additional poetry in 407. Now that we had that conversation, I'm currently teaching 304, and I think, well, you know, we of course did Dante, but maybe I can figure out something to do with Quixote at the end in poetry. I don't know.
Didn't Dante really critique? He was one of the first major poetry critiques, right? He wrote was he the one that wrote on the vernacular? Does anybody know? I forgot. I think he did. So he was a huge poetry critic, and that is one way to maybe get started with the great books and poetry, is because there was so much critique early on about what words to use, what vocabulary, and how to frame it and how to say it, and, you know, not to be too flowery, but all kinds of things. And I think there was, there was him, and then there was a few other early critiques that were just very good, but I don't remember who, because my brain just died.
Well, we're talking about critiques of poetry, and going back to the beginning of Jim's talk, one of the things I like to do in great books with the Republic is when he gives the critique of poetry, in concrete one in book 3, The one in book 10 is a little different. But Plato Socrates simply describes dialogue form. So he's describing his own form as the worst case, right? As the worst form. So like, doesn't this kind of look like what he's doing? And so I kind of hate that you've lived with that critique as being a sincere critique your whole life, because I'm pretty sure it's not. You're muted.
Yeah, well, he brings us back. That's the important thing. And to be honest with you, poets actually love it. To be kicked out means you're actually significant. So.
Some of my best Great Books 202 papers have been the poets responding, student poets who were just, did great. I mean, really wrote some great papers.
So I studied with the Polish poet Adam, hence the Polish poetry that you got. The Polish poet Adam Zagiewski, who passed away 2 weeks ago. But he has a great essay called Against Poetry, where he says, let's stop this. We sound too defensive. Let's just look at poetry and see why. Let's just let's have a poet actually argue against it. It's sly, of course. He's not really arguing against it. But I was thinking of him too, because he actually taught a class that I took called Great Poems. So there's a connection there. And they were all lyric.
Okay, I have my list. I don't know if these guys are in there, all of them, but if you start with Horace, Plato, Longinus, and Dante, those are your 4 major poetry critics early on. And so I think if you start there, then you're building that foundation for poetry, and they can see where it goes from there. So it might be a really nice way to do it.
One of the things
you can find them all in there, though, in the great books, maybe 3 of them.
With poetry and sort of diversifying the core, one of the things I was thinking about that I don't know if we talk about it much. Again, I'm new, but if we want more female voices, bringing in Emily Wilson, who's translated Homer, I think both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Alicia Stallings, who's a terrific poet and translator. She grew up in Decatur as well. These would be, because it does matter, who's making that translation. And so that's one way, if I'm ever down in the teaching at the first few sections, that's one way that I would try to think about it.
Yeah. Charlie, you used Emily Wilson this year, right?
Yeah, and right after the Great Books One group agreed to Sappho, in the next breath we agreed to Wilson's Odyssey. So we're there, Jim. We have ground to cover, but we're making progress.
Would Sor Juana be something appropriate for your program?
One of my students actually did recommend her. I believe she could fit either into 304 or 305. You'll have to, other folks will have to chime in here to correct me if I've gotten my dates wrong, but I think that she would also be a good candidate because she's writing in, if I'm not mistaken, in that tradition of women mystical writing within the church. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Tom, I'm sorry, I missed the name.
Sor Juana?
Yeah, it's been years since I taught her, but that sounds right. But when I was studying up on her, she was amazing and was doing what would be considered very male things in Mexico, and so she's worth looking at.
I think also, Stephanie, this goes to the idea that the more women writers we include in this canon, the more we will find that those women writers speak to one another, not just to the canon. And I think that enriching that network of texts will only help.
So while we're talking about translation, I had a list of some others. Susan Collins' translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which I think some of our folks have been using. And then a bit older translations by Dorothy Sayers, Song of Roland and of Divine Comedy. So I actually had another component that I've written that went along with this that we didn't have time for me to give you all of that, but to think about some strategies, and in addition to diversifying the list of core texts, to think about strategies for inclusion. And that was one of them, was to think about including women translators, but also to focus on text about women in in some of the core texts that we have, and to use those experiences. And I found that, I know Kevin's left the room, but I found that to be part of when I used Montesquieu in 305. I had some of my experience was similar to Kevin's, but I also got a lot of pushback from my women students about the misogyny of Persian letters. And we had some good conversations about that, and many of them ended up writing about that, but they were very troubled, not only about his depiction of women in the Seraglio, but also of his depiction of women in Paris. And that was something I hadn't really expected or experienced. So that was a bit of a unexpected turn for me. But
I know we have to go, but can somebody tell me quickly-ish what kind of writing you have them do? Like we have them work on argumentative writing, but do you do some other kinds of assignments?
Charlie, you want to weigh in?
You want me to? Okay. Yeah. It is a longish answer, Amy, but I'll try to give you the brief. And then I know everybody here would be happy to talk to you more about this. Certainly I will. We have one writing program at Mercer, regardless of whether you are in the Great Books program or in the Integrative Studies program. Students are, we work toward the same student learning objectives for writing. And so the Great Books 1 course has a corollary in the other track, etc. And some of that insists that students write in different genres, that they do research. And so we found ways of incorporating those writing requirements into our program. For the first 2 Great Books courses, we have an extra hour attached to the courses for writing instruction. So I'll have 3 seminars a week and a writing workshop with my students every week in Great Books 1, and Great Books 2 is the same. I have them do a personal narrative. They introduce themselves to me with a book, is how we start. Later in the semester, they take something out of Thucydides and look for, articles in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal that find a dynamic out of Thucydides and see it mirrored in the contemporary world. So most of the writing is conventional argumentative writing. You do exegesis, you figure out a thesis, you make an argument, but not all of it. We're very intentional. All the stuff that everybody does, scaffolding and drafting and stuff like that, peer reviews. We have a writing program and a writing director, and we're intentional about all that stuff.
It sounds wonderful.
we work pretty hard. We've got a lot of folks here that work very hard.
My comment was, it's a lot of work. The writing program has worked with us so that we've been able to meet some of their goals within the Great Book text. And so we managed to do both.
Well, I got to go give a cat an antibiotic, and I have a class at 6 o'clock Arizona time. So I'm going to see you all around.
Okay.
And we are at time. So I want to say thank you to our panelists for your contributions, and to all of you for such a rich conversation.
Bye.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the conversation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
I guess Joseph's going to turn off the recording.
All right.
Yep.
So